Economic sanctions are a powerful tool in the United States foreign policy arsenal, often used to exert pressure on governments or entities that violate international norms or pose a security threat. These sanctions are typically aimed at altering the behavior of the targeted country by limiting its access to global trade, capital, and resources. While the United States imposes sanctions for various reasons, their effects ripple across the globe, influencing international trade and global prices in profound ways. This video explores the top 10 impacts of U.S. economic sanctions on global trade and prices. 1. Disruption of trade routes. One of the most immediate impacts of U.S. sanctions is the disruption of established trade routes. Sanctions often prohibit or severely limit trade between sanctioned countries and the U.S. or its allies, forcing businesses to seek alternative markets. This disruption can lead to delays, higher transportation costs, and the rerouting of goods. For instance, sanctions on Iran have forced the country to rely on less efficient shipping routes, raising transportation costs and reducing trade efficiency. 2. Reduced access to global financial markets. Many U.S. sanctions target access to global financial markets, including restrictions on the ability to use the U.S. dollar, the world's dominant currency. Sanctioned countries often find it difficult to conduct international transactions, as most global financial institutions use the dollar. This limitation forces businesses and governments to find alternative currencies or financial institutions, often at a higher cost, which impacts global liquidity and increases the risk for international trade. 3. Inflationary pressures on sanctioned countries. Sanctions can lead to significant inflation within targeted nations. The restricted access to goods, services, and foreign currency creates supply shortages, driving up prices domestically. For example, sanctions on Venezuela have severely curtailed its oil exports, reducing foreign currency earnings and making imports more expensive, resulting in hyperinflation. These inflationary pressures ripple beyond the sanctioned country, affecting global prices for certain commodities and goods. 4. Increased global prices for targeted goods. Countries subjected to U.S. sanctions are often major producers or exporters of certain goods, such as oil, metals, or agricultural products. When sanctions limit their ability to export these goods, global supply diminishes, leading to increased prices. For example, sanctions on Russia and Iran, both of which are major oil exporters, have affected global oil supply, contributing to higher prices for crude oil and refined petroleum products worldwide. 5. Creation of parallel economies. In response to sanctions, some sanctioned nations create parallel economies that operate outside of international financial systems. These economies typically involve alternative forms of trade, such as barter systems, or reliance on non-Western financial networks, such as those in China or Russia. While this may allow for continued trade, it increases the overall inefficiency of global markets and often leads to inflated costs, as the country must bypass the more efficient, regulated global systems. 6. Strain on supply chains. Sanctions can create significant strain on global supply chains. When companies are unable to source raw materials or finished goods from sanctioned countries, they must look to alternative suppliers, which can disrupt existing supply chain relationships. This may lead to increased costs and longer lead times, ultimately raising prices for consumers worldwide. For example, sanctions on North Korea have forced companies in East Asia to find new sources for certain minerals, driving up prices in the region. 7. Shift in global trade alliances. U.S. sanctions often result in shifts in global trade alliances. Countries that are heavily sanctioned may seek new trade partners to circumvent U.S. restrictions, leading to the formation of new trade blocs. The most prominent example is China, which has increasingly filled the gap left by Western countries in markets traditionally dominated by the U.S. This shift can alter global trade flows, creating new economic dependencies and influencing pricing patterns. 8. Impact on multinational corporations. Multinational corporations, MNCs, are often forced to reconsider their global strategies when faced with U.S. sanctions. These companies may either cut ties with sanctioned countries or incur financial penalties for continued trade. The uncertainty surrounding sanctions can lead to higher operational costs, as MNCs must navigate complex legal frameworks and find ways to operate in less predictable environments. Additionally, the imposition of sanctions often results in asset freezes, which can further disrupt business operations and drive up prices for consumers. 9. Rebalancing of commodity markets. Sanctions can lead to the rebalancing of global commodity markets, especially when major producers are targeted. When a country is sanctioned, global demand for its products shifts, which can create price fluctuations. For instance, sanctions on Iran have resulted in a decrease in its oil production, which caused an increase in demand for oil from other countries, raising prices in the global market. Similarly, sanctions on Russia, a leading exporter of wheat, have led to supply shortages in certain regions, impacting food prices globally. 10. Long-term economic consequences. While the immediate impact of U.S. sanctions is often a disruption in trade and a spike in prices, the long-term economic consequences are more far-reaching. Countries under sanctions often experience prolonged economic stagnation, as limited access to global trade and capital markets reduces their economic growth potential. Over time, this stagnation can have a domino effect on regional economies, leading to increased unemployment, reduced consumer spending, and ultimately higher prices as domestic economies struggle to meet demand for goods and services. U.S. economic sanctions are a tool of immense power, but their consequences are felt far beyond the borders of the targeted country. From disrupting global trade routes to driving up commodity prices, the ripple effects of sanctions influence economic activity around the world. While the intended purpose of sanctions is often to bring about political or behavioral change, the resulting shifts in trade dynamics, financial markets, and global supply chains can have profound and lasting impacts on global trade and prices. As the global economic landscape continues to evolve, the role of sanctions as a foreign policy tool will remain a subject of significant debate, particularly in light of their broad and far-reaching effects.